My name is Chris Spannos. I'm a staff member with ZNet hosting this panel. It's this panel titled Rebellion and Self-Organization in Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. The last part of the title about the Eastern Mediterranean is a holdover from somebody else who was going to join and give us some history into radical movements in the 19th century and today in Syria and Lebanon and Cairo and Alexandria, who couldn't be here today. We've got a wonderful panel. During the initiation of the uprisings in Tunisia and then afterwards, I was very excited, very much glued to Al Jazeera and watching things. And at the same time, I was reading articles that I found were concerned first and foremost with the people of those countries, not necessarily who was going to come to power next, as our Western media here in the U.S. was primarily concerned with. And some of those articles were by Horace Campbell, who's sitting in the center here, writing about Tunisia. He was publishing a lot in Pambazuka News at the time.
And Pambazuka is here.
And Pambazuka's here. Okay, wonderful. And David Porter was publishing as well. We published some stuff through ZNet. And he was also had a syndicated article through the Institute for Public Accuracy. And Matta, who's on the far right here, she also published through ZNet and whose work was recently quoted extensively by Noam Chomsky in one of his syndicated columns. So we thought that this work was very useful to people. People thought it was interesting, and I thought it was a great opportunity to get them together in the same room to give us their insights. They've been working so hard and so long on exploring these countries and the current events now and trying to frame them with the people of those countries as the center concern of their analysis. So we will get started. We'll begin, if we had a map behind us here.
Why don't we put one up?
Why don't we do we have one? Does anybody have a map of North Africa?
The room is wired.
This is America.
Yeah. Well, we can use our imaginations, and it might be quicker and less technologically problematic. But Algeria would be over here in your left. Tunisia would be up in the top corner, and my drawing is terrible. But the imagination's more colorful, and Egypt would be over here. So, in any case, that's the broad, area of the world we're talking about. The northern region of the African continent, and so we'll begin by discussing Algeria with David Porter. And he'll discuss how while the economic, social, and political oppression in Algeria is similar to those other two countries, the revolutionary or insurgent potential hasn't yet to erupt. So he'll be discussing what's different about Algeria. He'll be discussing the Algerian context, and he'll explain how it's different and the possibilities for a radical, decentralized alternative to the present regime. After that, we will discuss Tunisia with Horace Campbell, who will focus on self-organization and self-emancipation in Tunisia. Horace has been active in the Black liberation and peace and justice movements for years. He's author of many books, including Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanists, and African Liberation in the 21st Century. He currently teaches at Syracuse University, and he has a new book out, Barack Obama and 21st Century Politics, A Revolutionary Moment in the U.S. He's got some books in the front row here that are available. And finally, we'll end the discussion with Matta presenting on Egypt. She argues that to understand the character of the uprising, that it's necessary or important to explore the link between the youth movement that initiated the uprising and Tahrir Square and worker mobilizations during the last decade. While workers' demands were mostly economic, the youth movement has uprising, their demands have been mostly political. So each of the presenters will present for 25 minutes or so. I'll give them the opportunity, if they have it, to ask each other some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions to everybody. We're going to have to move fairly fast in the question and answer period, just so that we can cram everything in the time allotted to us. So without further ado, here's David Porter.
Well, I want to start out by pointing out that today is the 49th anniversary of the signing of the Evian Accords, which was the ceasefire for the 8-year-long revolution of Algeria for national independence against the French. Those accords laid the groundwork for what the new independent regime would be and brought a close to an absolutely horrendous liberation struggle, definitely one of the most important liberation struggles in the Third World of the 1950s and 60s. The estimates of those who died range from 300,000 to 1 million in that combat, and that is still a major transition point in the history of the colonial into the post-colonial era. I mention that especially because what we're talking about is what the news commentators have referred to as the political liberalization going on in North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, the revolution for independence was a much greater transformation in many ways than anything that's going on at this point, and I would be quite hesitant to refer to any of the transitions at this point as revolutions. They're certainly very significant, but we have yet to see how they're going to work out in the various countries. But in any case, the basic question was raised by what actually happened with the Algerian Revolution. The question is how to coordinate various realms of social insurgency and to create and sustain a power from below to prevent the co-optation of the people's aspirations and the people's movement for liberation. It's something that Frantz Fanon certainly talked a lot about in The Wretched of the Earth, and with specific reference to Algeria as well as other areas of the Third World. I think it's that same agenda that we have to look at. How can the various realms of social insurgency in each of these countries be coordinated sufficiently to basically bring about a radical new political system, and how to sustain that energy and organization from below to prevent the co-optation of the people's power. I won't go into the various negative conditions in Algeria at present in detail. They're very comparable to what you've been hearing in the news or reading about in terms of the economic, social, and political oppression. Algeria is a wealthy country in terms of its natural resources, especially in natural gas and oil. Huge amounts of income have come into the country, but it's very poorly distributed. So there's immense poverty. Housing conditions are very bad, very inadequate reservoir of housing, and all of the oppression that comes out of that situation, especially for young people who, as in the other areas of North Africa and the Middle East, represent about 70% of the population, that is, those who are under age 30. The job situation, again, is very poor, as in other parts of North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, for young people, a large number of them feel like there's absolutely no future in Algeria. They're really quite desperate, and that's been true for quite a while. It's an authoritarian regime that's been basically managed by the military ever since independence. And in fact, the military, indeed the exterior military, those that were beyond the borders of Algeria because the French were in control during the revolution, it's that group that has really had power, and its descendants all the way to the present. Officials, as in other countries, are known for being arrogant and contemptuous towards the population from the national level on down to the local level. The bureaucracy and the highest level of the military are intensely corrupt. Fortunes have been made because of the various positions of power that people hold. And the regime has been consistently repressive against political opposition. in varying degrees, but in any case, a very arbitrary kind of rule. While there is a kind of democratic veneer in the country for the last decade, in fact, there's pretty tight political control. The parties that do exist and the journals, the newspapers, state-supported as well as those that are private, are significantly limited in what they can say. The line of acceptability changes from time to time, but it's very clear that journalists can be arrested, apparently very arbitrarily, and imprisoned. The trade union is very much controlled. The central trade union, the UGTA, is very much controlled by the regime. And yet there is a variety of forms of resistance by the population to this situation. In the last presidential election in 2009, about 25% of the eligible voters actually participated. That was for the most major kind of election. The abstention rate is considerably beyond that for the National Assembly and local elections. That's one form of resistance. Another form is simply migration for those who can afford to do it, and that's been going on for a long time. For those who really can't afford to do it, there's the alternative of trying to escape across the Mediterranean in poorly constructed rafts or small boats, a very desperate kind of ploy which hundreds and thousands have engaged in over the years, some of them surviving, some of them not. Many of them turned away once they reached the shore of Italy or Spain or France. Most dramatically, there was a wave of riots in Algeria before those that started in Tunisia. And in fact, those riots and demonstrations have been going on for almost a decade in Algeria, but they got more attention once things started happening in other parts of North Africa. Probably the most consistent image in the demonstrations and riots has been, and this occurs all throughout Algeria, from small villages through up to the cities, is young people blocking roads with burning tires, attacking police headquarters, burning them to the ground if they can, attacking party headquarters, other government offices, sometimes attacking the stores that sell to affluent customers. Very dramatically, and we know about this, of course, from the beginning of the Tunisian revolt, there have been, at least at this point, some 15 or 16 people who have set themselves on fire in absolute frustration, rage, agony with the situation that they're faced with in Algeria. I won't go into the different groups that are part of the opposition right now for the sake of time, but it is very comparable to the kinds of groups that have emerged in other parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Students, there are several autonomous trade unions separate from the central trade union federation that's controlled by the government. There are women's groups at the local level. There's a very active human rights organization that's been there since the 1980s, which has been taking very courageous stands on various occasions. But these various groups, including some from the political class, that is, some opposition party political leaders and their members, they have been trying to engage in demonstrations calling for a major change in the political system, especially from January on, and especially in response to this tremendous inflation of demonstrations and riots that have been going on at the local level by younger people. The government has totally squashed the ability of these demonstrations to proliferate, to even prosper in the place of their origin. In the center of Algiers, though the state of emergency has been lifted, There are laws in place, says the government, which prevent any demonstrations from occurring, any marches from occurring in the capital city. They say they can go on in other parts of Algeria, but in fact, many of those have been closed down as well. So while you have some very courageous people coming out every Saturday and on various other occasions, there were supposed to be 2 big demonstrations today, one led by youth that are unconnected to any of the political parties, and another one by a group that's been coming out every Saturday. They are totally surrounded by the police, like a 30-to-1 ratio, and they can't get anywhere. And the regime has also hired thugs, as in Egypt, to go after those who are demonstrating, to throw stones at them, to outshout them, and so on. Basically, the regime has tried in every way that it can to halt any kind of momentum for political change in Algeria. There's been a lot of pressure, obviously, from the events in Algeria's neighbors. There are some indications that the U.S. has even encouraged there to be a certain amount of regime change, but as some people have said, this is more, I think, towards the beautification of the regime rather than a significant overall transition. They have subsidized prices for some of the basic goods, for example. They have taken certain measures to legalize the important black market sector of the economy, and they did lift the state of emergency, but without any real effect. They are also making some cautious promises. That is, that they're going to start opening the media, allow independent television stations, perhaps. Everything is government controlled at this point, so the opposition gets very poor coverage for getting its word out. They have promised that maybe there will be a change of ministers in the coming weeks and months. They've even talked about the possibility, and this is not announced openly, but it's certainly a strong rumor that there will be elections very shortly, at least for the National Assembly, if not a new round of elections for the president. And they've also talked about having potentially a new constitutional assembly to draw up a new regime. But that's something that's sort of held in the background. People are talking about it. Some people are hopeful for it. Some people think that this won't get anywhere as long as the existing regime is still very much in the control. But they've also been continuing their negative attitude towards any kind of political opposition, as I mentioned, with the heavy police coverage. The military is mobilized. They, in fact, recently gave a big pay raise to soldiers and the police to assure themselves of the loyalty of those groups. They are continuing their policy of heavy infiltration of the opposition and manipulating various political parties to the point that people in the various parties often don't even want to be in coalitions with other parties because they think that those other parties are being manipulated by the government. They don't really know who to trust, and that's a very significant legacy of this long period of authoritarian rule. There's also the threat of radical Islamism, and I'll talk about that in a minute because it's got a very heavy connotation in Algeria. What I want to mention is 6 factors that I think are differentiating Algeria from the cases of Tunisia and Egypt. Why there hasn't been, despite this major record of insurgency at the grassroots level for a long period of time, plus the fact that Algerians are basically known by many people as extremely anti-authoritarian from the time of French colonial rule all the way down to the present, with many instances to show that, and I'll talk about several of those too. But first of all, there is no open dictator, as in the case of Ben Ali and Mubarak. Abdelaziz Bouteflika is the president. He's been the president for a little over 10 years. He was basically chosen by the military to be their civilian face. So he hasn't been around as long as those others to acquire that central focus of the opposition as feeling like at least symbolically, if not beyond that, it was important to knock off the existing president. That's not necessarily as central a focus for Algerians, because also the military has been very much behind the authoritarian regime, and specifically over the last couple decades, the security forces, the internal security of the military, the DRS as it's known, which is really a political police, very much kind of combination of the CIA and FBI, which has really infiltrated all of the government offices, many of the parties, and has engaged in arbitrary arrest and torture consistently for a long time. So it's not clear, and people keep talking about, well, who's really in control? Is it Bouteflika, who's gathered more and more of the military generals on his side, or is it still the DRS? And a lot of the energy of the opposition has in fact been, I think, lost by this continual debate. Who do we focus on? And in fact, at this point, you'll find arguments on either side. But the basic point of those who want a real regime change, we've got to get rid of them both. Let's stop getting into this, who's allied with who here, who are the worst enemies. Let's get rid of them both. The second thing that's different in the case of Algeria is the Central Trade Union Federation is totally dominated by the regime. In the case of Tunisia, I think there was more leeway for the workers to organize through the auspices of the UGTT than is the case with the UGTA in Algeria. And that's a very significant kind of dynamic which is squashed from the beginning. As I said, there are several autonomous trade unions, but they're largely organizing professionals like in the health services and teachers, and they have been very militant. They have tried to carry out strikes of their own. And there also have been some wildcat strikes by local workers who are in the UGTA. But for the National Federation of the Trade Union to be absent from the struggle is a terrible weakness at this point. There also is an issue of regional autonomy in Algeria, which I think is not as significant an issue in Egypt and Tunisia. There's a significant Berber population, which is about 20% of the overall 33 or 34 million Algerians. They're located primarily in the area called Kabylia, which is a mountainous area to the east of Algiers, and they have been consistently very active in their resistance from the time of French colonialism all the way down to the present. But there has been such frustration with the continued unwillingness of central authorities in Algeria to acknowledge Berber identity and the Berber language as being an important part of national identity, that there finally have been, after a variety of insurrections at various levels down to the present, there has been a new movement formed for Kabylian autonomy, which is very divisive. There are many, many Kabylians, I think probably the majority, who are opposed to that movement, but it's significant enough, and this continuing rift between Kabylia and the rest of Algeria has been significant enough to cause, again, a certain amount of unease in terms of potential coalitions for organizing against the central authority. Another thing that's very important is that the regime is very rich. It has something like $150 billion of currency reserves available to it, which can be handed out to various social groups or those who wish to join the patronage system under the auspices of the regime. And that obviously can defuse a lot of potential opposition. Another very important factor is what Algeria went through in the 1990s. I won't go into detail about that right now, but that was another period of political liberalization in the late 80s, early 90s that occurred after some major demonstrations and repression against the grassroots. The military authorities then played with this political democratization period and ultimately were playing off the growing political Islamist movement, which had very strong radical elements within it, against the secular, more democratic-oriented opposition. They played them off against each other, and finally the whole thing exploded in the face of the military when the political Islamists in the FIS party won the legislative elections. The first round at the end of 1991, they were absolutely predicted to win the second round and become the dominant group in the National Assembly. And the military stepped in. No, we can't stand this. We're not going to allow it. And repressed the political Islamist movement, which they had already started doing before that time, but so significantly that it mobilized a tremendous number of people in the FIS, some of whom were already organizing their guerrilla groups. And it ended up being a horrendous civil war between the military and the Islamist movement in the 1990s, which ultimately brought the death of some 200,000 people. So that's in the back of the minds of people who are opposing the regime right now. Is it possible that if we really engage in a grassroots insurgency against this government, that something like that is going to happen again, which is a real nightmare? The Islamists are still a very significant part of the population, and it's not inconceivable that a similar kind of insurgency could be mounted. So even in terms of the cooperation between the secular elements and the Islamists, it's real questionable. The final factor is that obviously Algeria, the regime now has the advantage of watching what's happening elsewhere. And they are very carefully calibrating their response to the opposition. As I said, they're not allowing any kind of significant demonstrations to occur. And they're very carefully deciding which little reforms are we going to grant to the opposition at what time, and really maintaining a much more, in effect, kind of sophisticated control of the situation than Ben Ali or Mubarak did in their countries. The last thing I want to say, and we can talk about that later if people have questions about it, is that Algerians do have a significant experience with decentralized resistance, decentralized organization. I was there in 1965, 1966. I was studying the worker self-management movement, which was very extensive, involving some 600,000 Algerian workers, about a quarter of the male workforce, which came about right at the time of independence because 9/10 of the French population left the country and left a tremendous number of farms and factories empty of the management and ownership. And the workers stepped in spontaneously in many cases, eventually encouraged by the UGTA, which was more independent at that point, and also very much encouraged by the Ben Bella regime, which came into power for its own ideological and legitimization benefit. Ben Bella was interested in maintaining some degree of grassroots support separate from the military that he was in alliance with. The second phenomenon, so that's a very important example of decentralization that shows the creativity of Algerians at the grassroots. The second example I want to mention to close is what happened in 2001 in the face of continuing police repression of young people in Kabylia. There was one incident where a young high schooler was taken into the gendarmerie in one of the local villages and beaten up and then killed. As the word got out about that, people started rioting against the police, and it spread like wildfire throughout all of Kabylia. Along with the attacks on the gendarmerie and fighting off the repression that was then brought by the regime against those insurgents, there was a spontaneous creation of a network of grassroots council forms of organization based on the traditional village council system that incorporated people in all the villages and the neighborhoods of the cities throughout Kabylia, based on the grassroots, but then federated at regional levels and then ultimately at the top, but accountable to the base. as was the notion of traditional organization in Kabylia. And while many people looked on this as some kind of archaic form which didn't have any progressive content to it, in fact, it had very progressive implications. There were contradictions within it. Women were not allowed to be parts of these councils, which is part of the traditional culture in Kabylia, but women were very active in supporting what they were doing and had their own independent marches in the cities of Kabylia. But I'll stop there, but just it's another example which I think might be something to hope for when and if the grassroots insurgency of the various kinds that are right there below the surface right now get together sufficiently that there may be new forms of resistance and self-sustaining resistance against efforts to co-opt the militancy of people at the base against this very oppressive situation that people are living in.
Thank you, David.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me try one more time. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you. And I want to thank David for his presentation, because what he did is to give us some sense that what is going on in North Africa is not new. What he's done for us is to give us some sense of the depth of people's organizing against colonialism. And what is going on in North Africa today is very much a continuation, but a new turn in what I would say in my presentation is a revolutionary moment unlike any other in world history, and how this revolutionary moment is going to have an impact on international politics, which it has already had. I'm going to use the experience and the examples from Tunisia of self-organization to speak about how the experiences of Tunisia, these experiences are helping to inform new concepts of revolution in the 21st century. So that if we're thinking about revolutionary organization in the 21st century, we should be thinking about what are the ideas which underline revolution, what are the forms of organization that underline revolution, where the leadership coming from, and what are the implications for the rest of the world. I want to say very clearly before I start that this revolution in Tunisia is at the intersection of the pan-Arab and pan-African revolution. And there are many who try to represent what's happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Algeria as if this is an Arab phenomenon, taking these societies out of Africa and out of the relationship with the long experience of the African revolution. And we know that Pan-Arabism has a direct relationship to Pan-Africanism insofar as the articulators of the dignity of Africans, those who articulated a sense of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, influenced the Arab world, and we saw the confluence of this under Nasser. And what we need to remember at this point is while we're speaking about revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, and other parts of North Africa, that there are outstanding colonial questions that these revolutions have to deal with. There are two that are unspoken. One is the Western Sahara, and the other is Palestine. So that of the 23 countries that are called Arab countries, well, 11 of those countries are in Africa and have African history and African heritage. And one of those countries is not listed in the Arab League because one of those countries, the Western Sahara, is still considered a colonial state. So we cannot, as the left, meet and talk about North Africa and Arabia without seeing how the Arab League excludes the question of the Western Sahara. The second colonial question in North Africa and the Arab world is the question of Palestine. And my colleague here, I'm sure, is going to address the intersection between the Egyptian revolution and the struggles of the Palestinians.
see.
Yeah.
Not sure about that, but
Okay.
I'll say a couple of words.
Okay. All right. Well, if you won't, I'm going to say something. I will say something then. I will say, how is it that the struggles against colonialism in Western Sahara and Palestine will be pushed forward by the self-confidence of the Egyptian and Tunisian peoples? And so the last part of my presentation will deal with our responsibilities in relationship to these revolutionary processes that are underway. So I want to start with the introduction by speaking about Tunisia and how the full explosion of the Tunisian revolution has acted as an inspiration and as an example. What is the inspiration? It's simple, that all of the representation of political power, all of the representation of strength of regimes and the billions of dollars, the lesson is that once the people are organized to challenge these powers crumble. And the way in which we can prevent the reconstitution of the system without Ben Ali is by extending the revolutionary processes across the world so that they do not have time to reconstitute themselves. So let us talk about the first phase. I'm going to talk about phases and stages. And the first phase is the defeat of the dictatorial police state in Tunisia. And this is the phase. And the second phase is how to reconstitute popular power in Tunisia and Egypt. So in this first phase, we've had a major victory in Tunisia. And this major victory in Tunisia leaves us an opportunity to look at the analysis in terms of the youth, the neutralization of the military, the Worker-Student Alliance, the forms of organization, which we will talk about, which is the heart of this, which is the self-activity of people, and then finally I will talk about transformation. So, what happened in Tunisia? Here's a young man. Here's a young man, goes to school. Mohamed Bouazizi goes to school, gets educated. After he's educated, the society has no place for him. This is like it is in most parts of Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. The capitalist system does not have use for young people. So this young man finishes school and is working as a vegetable and fruit seller. He's working as a vegetable and fruit seller. The police harass him. He goes to the police station. He complains to the police about the harassment. They say nothing. He goes to the central legal headquarters in Sid. I have it in my notes here. He goes to complain. Nothing happens. So he sets himself on fire on December 17th. He sets himself on fire on December 17th as an expression of opposition to the police state that he lives in. He's in the hospital. His family and his friends organize about the police brutality, about the harassment. The lawyers come out on the street. So he's in the hospital from the December 17th until January the 4th. He joined the ancestors on January the 4th. while he's in the hospital, the youth from his town mobilizes through social network about the police brutality, about the oppression of workers in this town. And the people start to organize. And he becomes a symbol of how people must resist a police state. Not only to make sacrifice, but that people must organize against the police state. Who are they organizing against? They're organizing against the pillars of the state. The first pillar of the state is the capitalist class itself, the ones who own the major business. The second pillar of the state is the military. The third pillar of the state is the secret police. And the fourth pillar of the state is the political party. These pillars create a police state in Tunisia headed by Ben Ali, who's been there 23 years. And like Tunisia, like Algeria, like Egypt, in most parts of Africa, is a leadership that derives its legitimacy from an anti-colonial past. It's a leadership that represents itself as fighting for the people's rights. So Ben Ali goes to the hospital when there's a popular uproar against this young man who's dying, and then promises that he's going to do something for the youth. But Mohamed Abouazizi joined the ancestors on January the 4th. And from January 4th, 5th, 6th, the people in the streets of Tunis starting to mobilize to come out in large numbers against the regime. This is the second stage of this first phase, where the youth, using social media, are able to generate a level of self-mobilization and self-organization that puts in motion a level of popular organization that challenges the state. I think this is out of political practice. We're learning a theoretical point about revolution. And I want to repeat this. Out of self-organization and self-mobilization sets in motion the maturation of popular mobilization to challenge the state. And so with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets calling for the removal of the dictatorship. And that level of self-organization and self-mobilization by the youth unleashes the capability to link up progressive forces. In this sense, they've started a new recursive process. They started a new process to challenge the old regime, sets in motion new ideas and bring in new forces. What's the major new force that they brought in this stage? Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, which is a platform for information, which is very different from the news networks in North America and Western Europe, which are platforms for disinformation and psychological warfare. So Al Jazeera comes as a force to support the youth or in the process of self-mobilization. So that is the first phase, the first stage of this phase that is very important. The second stage is the neutralization of the military. This neutralization of the military comes from the level of self-mobilization and self-organization that gives a certain clarity about the goals, to the point that the military is neutralized and the military refuses to fire on the people. And that level of clarity leads to the consolidation of the second stage of the revolution in Tunisia, which is the overthrow of the Ben Ali regime. But on Thursday, Ben Ali announced that he will not run again, and that his son will not run again. And all that time, his son and his wife and his wife's brother, who are billionaires, are running away, trying to put the money in banks in Canada, in North America, in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things, I'm not going to focus on the billions of dollars that they have, because the billions of dollars that they have could be used to reconstruct the economy with a new configuration of power. But for that to happen, we have to strengthen the opposition here and in other parts of the world. So that's the second stage, where in this stage, the workers of Tunisia join with the youth. So here are the three forces: the workers, the youth, the women, and then we have the fourth, the Islamists, and all elements of socialists and communists. And of course, the role of Tunisian women becomes important here in the kind of leadership that they offer in the revolutionary process. I've been given one warning, so let me go to the point about forms of organization. The Tunisian revolution has clarified the limitations of vanguardism and the idea of the vanguard party for revolution. The Tunisian revolution has brought to the forefront the capabilities of progressive networks organizing for social justice. And what I'm putting forward is how new possibilities of networks have identified a number of networks of youth, networks of journalists, networks of cultural artists, religious leaders, socialists, communists. In other words, within these networks, we're past the point of having revolutionaries who are the advanced vanguard who can dictate the pace. Of course, there are limitations to this because the enemies of the revolution will work to undermine and work within these networks. But the dynamic of the revolution itself in these networks are taking the people to higher and higher levels of consciousness. So in the revolutionary process itself, we have not only the transformation of the consciousness of the people, the transformation of the consciousness comes from their confidence that they can overthrow the regime. And so we have the transformation of the organization of the people, the fact that the people can build their new organization. So the challenge is, how can they build these new transformed organizations to consolidate a new power? And what we have in Tunisia today is a sense of dual power. We have the remnants of the old regime, and we have the people who are organized or challenging that old regime. And we are at this stage where Ben Ali is overthrown and the people have to continue the struggle. So how do we transform Tunisia or transform Egypt and Libya? And these are the questions that are before us. In other words, self-organization, sacrifice, self-mobilization is not enough until the revolution extends itself, and in this case it's extended itself to Egypt, to Libya, to Bahrain, to Oman, Gabon, Djibouti, Ethiopia. In other words, we're in a revolutionary moment. And what is a revolutionary moment? It is that moment when the ideas, the organizations, the forms of politics can no longer keep the society together. And it's a revolutionary moment against capitalism. I need to say something here about the question of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism. Because within the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution, those of us who support revolution cannot be just bystanders, because we have to be involved in the debate, because those who are talking about it as an Arab revolution are trying to reproduce some ideas of Arabism which disconnects Tunisia and Egypt from Africa. And as Feroz said in the interview with Al Jazeera, Tunisia and Egypt are very much a part of Africa. But what part of Africa it is? Egypt clearly is part of the Nile and part of the long history of the African Revolution. So how is it that the revolution in Egypt and Tunisia can be informed by a higher level of politics that disavows all forms of chauvinism, whether it's white chauvinism, Arab chauvinism, African chauvinism, any kind of chauvinism that talks about the hierarchy of human beings. Because you cannot have a revolutionary process that talks about one group of people who are Arabs and another group who are Africans. It's either the revolution are liberating all from all forms of bondage, or it's not a revolution at all. So that is where we are. And the case of Libya, as pointed out very clearly, where we have a popular uprising and the language that is being used is leading to confusion. The language about rebels, as Feroz and I were discussing this morning, the language about rebels, uprising, and no-fly zone, this is creating a lot of confusion. And what Feroz said to me, we have to go back to the period of the Spanish Civil War, where we had people of international brigades going to support the revolution and having international brigades linking themselves with the revolution. So let me conclude by saying that revolution is a process. It's not an event. The revolutionary process in Tunisia is just in its embryonic stages. There'll be many twists, there'll be many turns, and possibility of counter-revolution. But that possibility of counter-revolution will depend on the extent to which the revolution in Libya is crushed, or the fact that Saudi Arabia could put troops inside of Bahrain, and we are not mobilizing against it. Saudi Arabia could not put troops in Bahrain without the connivance of the United States military, the French and British military. So what is our responsibility of the left in this country? This is what the Left Forum should be asking itself. The people of Wisconsin carried signs to say what they've learned from the African Revolution in Egypt and Tunisia. More than carrying signs, we have to study these revolutions. The information is coming out very clearly about the impact of these revolutions. The very same persons in the rule administration who was telling us that Ben Ali and Mubarak are forces for stability, they've gone to Tahrir Square and they've gone to Tunisia. They're studying the revolution in order to co-opt it. We should be studying the revolution of how to extend our Tahrir Squares here in New York City, right where we are here. We should be studying the revolution there to say, what are the lessons from Egypt, Tunisia, that can be extended to our struggles here? So the fight against capitalism to bring about a new form of human society can be accelerated. The Left Forum is taking place at a very opportune time in the history of humanity. The revolutionary process is working itself out, and we cannot be bystanders in a revolution, nor can we take 19th century ideas of left politics or 19th century ideas of revolution into the 21st century. What we will take from the 19th century are the ideas of the optimism of revolution, the inspiration about the centrality of working people, and the fact that it's working people who make history.
Okay, I want to thank the two speakers for their talks. I want to also stress that I'm just recently started working on Egypt, and have been there twice before the uprising to work on workers' mobilizations during the last decade. I will start by describing the main events of the Egyptian uprising, and then I'll try to answer the question about why the uprising happened and its character by first looking at three explanations that are out there. I'll discuss their merits and then present my initial thoughts on what I think explains what the character of the uprising is and what explains it. First, following the overthrow of Ben Ali in Tunis, young activists, mainly the group called the 6th of April, called for a protest, Day of Anger on 25th of January, to resist or to voice anger against the Egyptian regime. Now, they organized for this protest by calling 21 different protests around Cairo, and the idea was to confuse the security forces forces that by marching from different places to Tahrir Square, they will be able to confuse the security forces and maybe higher numbers reach Tahrir Square. So some of the protests reached Tahrir Square, and they continued and they occupied Tahrir Square and stayed there for a long time. The coalition that was formed, the youth coalition that was formed after reaching Tahrir Square and occupying it the first day, things quickly turned into a popular and mass uprising, and hundreds of thousands and millions of Egyptians took part all over Egypt, not only in Cairo, in daily protest. And the youth coalition that took over Tahrir Square, which became the symbol of the struggle, started organizing and kind of presenting their demands to the regime. The main demand that was put out there across Egypt from different Egyptian classes is that they want the overthrow of Mubarak and the overthrow of Mubarak regime. Workers participated in these protests initially as regular participants, but in the last 3 days they organized and participated as workers by stopping production. And I think this is very significant, and the army right after decided to ask Mubarak to step down, and the army took over basically the Egyptian regime. Now the mobilizations did not stop. They continued. They asked for the removal of the symbols of the regime, and so they continued to protest until Omar Slimane, which was appointed as a vice president by Mubarak, was also overthrown. The prime minister that Mubarak appointed was also overthrown, and they are also asking for a new constitution. And today is a big day in Egypt where the army assigned a committee to have amendments to the constitution. Now, most of the opposition parties are opposed to the amendments, and they want a new constitution, except the Muslim Brotherhood that is accepting it. And today, as I said, there's a big day. There's voting over the referendum. Just opening the news, like watching reading the newspaper this morning, is the first time that Egyptians actually go, participate in the referendum that they don't know what the result of it will be. So it's very exciting. And many people are going to participate in the referendum, something that did not happen before in Egypt in terms of referendums or elections. Okay, so these are like the main kind of major things that happened during the events of the uprising. I will argue that it is to understand the character of this uprising and why it happened. It's important to understand the link between the young activists who called for the uprising and the workers' movement, because the young activists, actually this movement who called for the initial day of anger was a movement that rose in support of workers who have been protesting for a decade in Egypt. But the demands of the youth coalition from the square, from Tahrir Square, were mainly political demands, and I'll discuss that later. But before that, I want to lay out three explanations that are out there that try to explain why the uprising happened. So the first one talks about three main kind of factors that had to come together for the uprising to take place in Egypt and in Tunis. The first one is the long-lasting grievances. The second one is the emotional factor. So in Tunis, it was Bouazizi, the self-immolation of Bouazizi, that angered Tunisians. In Egypt, it was the happy emotion of the Tunisian revolution. And the third factor is the impunity, the fact that the army did not attack the protesters. Now, I think the first one is very important. I will come back to it later, the long-lasting economic and social grievances. The second factor, I think, is a little bit, the second element is a little bit problematic to explain, to give as an explanation, I think, because people participate in protests and they are obviously emotional when they do. I think there's been other cases that might angered Egyptians. In 2009, there was a brutal killing of a guy called Khalid Said that led to a big, serious campaign in Egypt around the brutality of the police and the security forces. But it did not lead to the uprising that we saw. As for impunity, I think that Actually, in fact, I think it works the other way around. I think if we maybe imagine that only a small number of people showed up to the square on the second and third day of the uprising, maybe the police and the army would have crushed the protesters. I think the fact that a lot of people went out and responded to the call kind of restrained a military response to the protesters, and not the other way around. The second explanation is institutional. I think it's a compelling argument that is presented about institutional factors. So the argument is that the recent elections in December 2010, just before the uprising in January, there was unprecedented rigging in the elections in Egypt. And this angered a lot of people and even led to divisions among the elites. So the argument is that in 2005, the Egyptian regime, as a result of pressure from the American state, opened up the political system. For example, we had 88 Muslim Brotherhood members gain seats in the parliament, something that is very new. And this was closed in December because of the orchestration of Jamal Mubarak, the son of Mubarak, and the crony capitalists around him. They rigged the election, and for example, in 2010, only one Muslim Brotherhood was able to get a seat in the parliament. And even parts of the old guard of the ruling party were also expelled, which led to resentment among some factions of the elite. So the question is, I think, how much are the movements on the ground that initiated the uprising? It was not the Muslim Brotherhood or the traditional left that initiated the uprising. Were very conscious of these closing and opening up of the system, and they were resented it. And the other question is how much they really saw divisions among the elites and saw an opportunity to kind of participate in social movement because of divisions among the elite. I think these are two questions that need further examination, but still the argument is compelling and interesting. The last argument that is out there is more weighted towards the economic factors. And the argument is that this is a class war. It's not mainly about democracy. Democracy is important, but it's not mainly about democracy. It's a class war. And because of the because the recession reached the Middle East, and Arab countries. For example, Egypt had suffered a lot from decrease in exports. Egypt depends a lot on remittances, and there has been a decline since 2008, serious declines in remittances. So this is basically, and the neoliberal policies that have been put forward in Egypt, this is what we see now is a class war across the Middle East. And there's a political element to that, resentments of Egyptians towards Egyptian elite and its alliance with the US and Israel, but mostly it's really an argument about the economic factors. And I want to argue that by looking at the actors of the movement, it is in fact actually a movement. I want to stress the democratic aspect of the movement. And I think it is mostly an uprising for democratic reforms, for dignity, for freedom, universal values kind of that go across all the Middle East and that everybody is demanding. But it's interesting to see that the 6th of April movement that led, this is in spite of the fact, and this is why the link is important, in spite of the fact that this movement that initially called for the uprising really rose in support of workers' strikes and militancy. So in 6th of April 2008, workers in Mahalli, which is a hub for labor militancy, textile workers, militant textile workers in Mahalli, organized a strike to demand minimum wage for workers in Egypt. Now these workers have been organizing since 2006. They had a big demonstration in protest in December 2006, where they gained concessions from the government, and the protest led to a cycle of protests in different 30,000 in textiles and 300 in different industries. 2007 was the biggest number of workers' protests in Egypt. So this labor militancy drew the attention of political activists and youth activists in Cairo, and they wanted to support, and they called, the 6th of April movement basically was born when it called for support for the workers in Mahalli through calling for a general strike in Egypt. Now, of course, this freaked out the regime. They the strike in the factory did not happen. The general strike did not succeed as well. Actually, there was an uprising in Mahalli, and the security forces crushed it. And a lot of labor militants were punished, and so were the 6th of April movement that were persecuted by the state after calling for to demand minimum wage in support of workers in Mahalli. But it's interesting to see that when they participated in when they called for the day of protest and the coalition that they were part of, these economic demands that they earlier put forward were not present in their demands, and they focused on political demands. And now, for example, in their negotiations, there's negotiations between them, the leaders of 6th of April, and the army. They focus on release of political prisoners, end of emergency law, and the installment of the technocratic government. So their main demands, this was also when the youth, as I said before, released their demands to the regime, they were all political demands. Now, if we look at the workers, I think it's significant that the workers did not participate as workers from day one. It took them time to organize and start participating as workers and stopping production in the last 3 days of the uprising. I think this is very significant I would argue, for the success of the uprising. The fact that workers in the last 3 days were able to put an effect of a general strike kind of stressed the ruling elite and the army, and I think partly explains why the army demanded that Mubarak step down. The workers, importantly, continued to strike day one, like the first day after the uprising and the stepping down of Mubarak. They continued, are still protesting in different industries, and their demands are also, I would say, mostly democratic, but more challenging in terms of the economic system in Egypt. So they demand minimum wages, increase in profits and benefits, but they also challenge their managers. They want changes in their managers, the official trade union. I haven't said that, but all of these protests have been against the official trade union. The official trade union is in alliance with the Egyptian regime since the 60s. So these are all militant workers that go against their official union. There hasn't been a clear voice, a unified voice for workers so far, and this is something that we will see how it will develop. There has been a call for an independent confederation. It's not clear how much it's bottom up or it was initiative really from a couple of militant workers. I hear different interpretation of that by talking to people in labor activists in Cairo. It's not clear how much it's the workers are starting to organize and trying to present a unified call. But this is something that there's continues. The important thing is that they're continuing to protest and organize and demanding independent unions locally. So what I think is explains why this uprising happened. I think there's three main factors that explain the uprising. First, I think the Tunisian demonstration effect is very important. I think Egyptians felt that you have people going out to the streets and being able to overthrow a dictator was very, very empowering to people who went out in Egypt. The second one is the internal trigger, and I talked about it. The internal trigger election seems to be, to me, an important trigger, but it needs further, as I said before, examination. But the third factor, and I think it's overlooked by a lot of people, is organizing skills. These uprisings did not just pop up in 25th of January. So you have both workers and youth movement. The youth movement, this same movement of 6th of April, since 2008, they have been organizing over different campaigns in Cairo, and they have been, for example, training over nonviolent action. They called for a general strike in 2009, but it failed. It's not their first attempt, so this is the third attempt for calling for general strike. And they have been organizing youth around them and mainly focusing a lot on police brutality. As I said, there was a campaign also against the killing of a young man in Alexandria. So there had been organizing both via the internet and media, but also actual organizing between the youth. And the workers workers have been organizing since 2004. So they just did not spontaneously pull out this general strike in the last 3 days of the uprising. They have been, since 2004, there have been protests all over Egypt. There has been around 3,000 protests in which 2 million workers participated in. They have developed local leadership in the different sectors and industries, and these leaderships, I think, had to played a role in what happened in the uprising. Of course, the background for these mobilizations are the structural changes that have been taking place in Egypt. And the neoliberal policies has taken place since 2003 and 2004, increasing cuts in benefits. This already started in 91, but increasingly since 2003 and 2004, cuts in benefits and bonuses. There was a new law in 2003 that undermined labor rights and their power vis-a-vis employers, increased the job insecurity. That's why we see a lot of temporary workers now protesting in Egypt to ask to be permanent workers, because this law really increased the levels of how much work employers can basically fire employer or workers or turn them into temporary workers. Also, there's high levels of poverty in Egypt, high levels of unemployment. And I think here there's an interesting thing to kind of pay attention to, that the youth that have been leading these protests are said to be there is high level of unemployment among them. So for me, there's a little bit of a disjuncture between the high levels of unemployment and the kind of avoidance of economic demands that during the revolution, and the focus on the political and democratic demands. This is something that needs further, I think, examination. But the structural changes has led to one thing that I think angered people a lot, and is that polarization among Egyptian society. When I was in Mahalli, this is something that came up constantly, and it comes up with most Egyptians, that there is increased polarization. People compare their lifestyle to the lifestyle of elites, how workers were complaining about how they can't feed their kids meat while their managers eat turkey and meat and go to luxurious vacations. And this was this angered people. And here comes, I think, they talked about humiliation and dignity, and this was very much influenced by this increasing polarization in Egyptian society. I think it's important to okay, so if I want to kind of talk about the successes and the challenges. The successes, as I said before, there were already a lot of successes in terms of rejecting the symbols of the regime. There was the dismantling of the security forces. Security forces were expelled out of universities. There is, I think, the consciousness and the debate. It's just you open the Egyptian newspapers. There's debate over every policy, and people are all involved in these debate. And this, I think, this is a success of the movement, that there is consciousness about being involved and participating in politics. But as for the challenges, I think there's serious challenges for the movement. First, we've already seen that there's divisions among the youth movement. Not this Tuesday, last Tuesday, they organized a protest, and some of the coalition already changed their positions and asked their activists not to go out, because they want to give the army and the government a chance. And I think the positions that many of the youth leaders have toward the army is a little bit problematic. Some of them would say, the 6th of April leaders, that we gave the army a very difficult package and they have to deal with it. And they're not quite aware of or at least in their statements, of the in a different interest really that the army has. We already seen how they reacted to the continuous protests on Tuesday, where they allowed thugs to attack protesters, and they allowed thugs to attack female protesters who celebrated the Women's Day. So there is, and constantly the army is actually calling on workers to stop striking. It's calling them, asking them to be more nationalist and care about the country. And the workers' demands are being presented as sectarian by the army, but not only by the army, by a lot of other liberal movements that are out there. And I haven't seen a lot of the youth leaders kind of going against that. So the opposite. They're trying to, some of them are trying to build this kind of nationalist discourse that now we should all be united, and workers' demands are suddenly these sectarian demands that the strikes should stop. So these are serious challenges for the movement to kind of check the army and the army's interests. This army has alliances, different kind of levels of alliances with the previous regime's economic interests, with the US. So the movement has to continuously kind of check this army, who is still in control now of the regime. And this is something that is worrisome. The second challenge, I think, is the Muslim Brotherhood. We already saw that they are allying with the army over the referendum for the constitution. So they're a very strong movement and organized more than any other movements on the ground, and they're already allying with the regime over the referendum. So there is this danger of an alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army that would actually co-opt the uprising. And people are aware of that and discuss that over all. If you just open the newspapers, this is something that people are very aware of. Again, I think the challenge of the workers challenge for the workers to kind of continue mobilize and present their demands, to be at the forefront of demands, especially that they are motivation for a lot of people that went out there and participated in the uprising.
Thank you.
How much time do you have?
We have about 25 minutes left for discussion. I did want to provide the opportunity for any of the panelists if they had questions for one another real quick before opening it up to the rest. Because of the time, we'll have to be concise and quick in our questions and responses to allow as much participation as we can.
I would just like to ask one question, which you didn't mention, because when this man came back from exile and he made the speech to say that the revolution will have to lift the blockade in Gaza, what do you think is the importance of the lifting of the blockade for the revolution in Egypt?
Yeah, I think the Gaza issue and the first Intifada actually had a lot to do with the youth and the middle class mobilizations in Egypt, and it influenced Egyptians and it influenced Tunisians. The Palestinian question has been like influencing all the Arab world, but I would say that in the uprisings, it was not the most important thing for Egyptians. They were mostly concerned with really democracy and dignity and freedom in their country. So, and not to undermine the importance of Palestine, but I think that underestimate what the first Intifada or the Palestinian cause. But I think they're mainly concerned with internal democratic issues and less with the Intifada. Now we'll see that, I think, as the revolution will develop, and if the revolutionaries or the people who led the uprising will take more power, I can say definitely see changes in the relationship with Gaza, and that's something to be expected. But I think the main concerns of Egyptians, and I'll speak only of Egyptians, were really the internal issues.
Okay. Let me address the first question of democracy. The struggles in Tunisia and Egypt are democratic struggles. The nature of the democracy is intrinsic to the forms of organization that they're unleashing. In other words, it's not a democracy which is based on elections every 5 years or every 4 years. What we have in North America is formal democracy without democracy. In other words, and even that formal democracy, they're taking away from you now. I think you've seen the new law in Michigan. Everybody here seen the new law in Michigan? No? where the governor can take away the right for local government to elect their own representatives. And sell it and give it to corporations. In other words, what is called democracy in the United States is actually the rule of capital disguised as democracy. So what the people, and what in the United States and America, one of the fundamental democratic rights has been taken away from people, which is the right to collective bargaining. The attempt by Scott Walker to take away the right to collective bargaining in Wisconsin is something that they have taken away for the last 30 years. They want to seal it in this country. So when we're talking about democracy, let us talk about democratic rights at all levels of the society. As we understand in Tunisia and in Egypt, the people are talking about the rights of workers for collective bargaining, better pay, health, safety conditions, housing, sanitation. These democratic rights cannot be obtained under capitalism. Therefore, for the democratic rights to be attained in Egypt and Tunisia, we have to struggle to support their democracy. So they're a global rights movement. How do we support the women of Egypt and Tunisia? Because the leadership of the revolution in Egypt and Tunisia, a very important role is played by women. How does our solidarity, and that's the name of this conference, support the role of women? So the global women's rights, the global rights for collective bargaining, global religious rights, global environmental rights, global human rights, all of these rights form the basis of a new democracy in the 21st century. We have to move away from this idea of democracy, which is simply based on voting. Yes, those who are involved in voting, young people must now go out in New York, in our municipalities, on school boards to participate in elections. On the question of Libya, this is a popular uprising that is creating a lot of confusion. Because in the case of Libya, we have a leader that is a repressive leader who is at the same time an anti-imperialist leader. And it's not new. Saddam Hussein was repressive and is anti-imperialist. But we do not support Saddam Hussein because he's anti-imperialist. We oppose the Western invasion of Iraq because although we are opposed to Saddam Hussein, we are also opposed to the Western invasion of Iraq. So this is where we need to have a higher level of clarity on the left about what we support. If we support the Libyan uprising, we cannot do it blindly. We have to support the Libyan uprising in a way in which we suggest to them that if they're struggling against the Gaddafi dictatorship, they cannot then go and make an alliance with NATO, and they cannot use language about African mercenaries, and they attack Africans who are being manipulated by Gaddafi, so that they will go house to house and take out black Africa. So our solidarity with the Libyan revolution must be a solidarity which informs and strengthens their revolution. So the question of how do we stop Gaddafi bombing their people is difficult. We want that to end. But we don't think NATO has any role in this thing. So I think that we should be informed like we were against Saddam Hussein. Now on the last question on the military. The military is not homogeneous. In both Tunisia and Egypt, the military has great divisions in their ranks. In the top echelons of the military, we know this because the book about Egypt military society was written in the 1960s. The top sections of the Egyptian military have the same class interests as American military, as military everywhere. But it's the rank and file of the military. All the workers have their cousins. And so how to advance the neutralization of the military, I believe, is this phase of the revolution. Which brings us to where we are in the United States of America. I was just telling Firoz now How many of you know of a company called Cerberus? You know about Cerberus, right? Cerberus is one of the biggest capital management companies. Cerberus is the owner of DynCorp, which is a private military corporation. So what the military is doing is going to develop privatized armies. So they privatize education, they're privatizing health, they're privatizing schools, and now they want privatized army. They're privatizing armies because they cannot trust the future of armies like in Tunisia or Egypt. So they have to have their own private armies. So we have to do political work in the United States to neutralize the army. So the army will disband these privatized army, and we will stop spending the $1 trillion in the army while we cut schools, cut education, cut housing, cut health care. Why is it there's no discussion in this austerity talk in America about cutting the military? That is why the talk about the military in Egypt is not something that's out there and we're here.
I think when looking at a place like a third world country like Egypt, formal democracy is an advancement to many people in a place like Egypt. And the basic, even democratic rights of election, of being able to decide who is gonna rule your small province, your town, and that this person is not imposed by the ruling party, is very, very significant to people's life, not only in terms of them feeling free to choose, but also in terms of dignity and being able to decide on basic things that for many, I think in the West, we take for granted. They are advancement that many people actually aspire. It's not they want that. They are posing it as something that they want. And if they are posing it as something that they want, I think it's very important to take it seriously. Of course, this democracy that, I mean, I'm not going to talk, I don't think the US is actually a good example, but exactly because of the things that you said, because of the ferocious capitalist system here and how much workers are weak in the US and cannot kind of oppose the interests of capital. But in Egypt, I think it's a serious question, the question that has been raised here, how these democracy, the quest for democracy that is, we don't have any socialist revolution on the ground going in any of these countries, I think. There are socialist parties, very small and minor, that hopefully they will grow and gain more popularity among the people. But in Egypt, currently, workers' demands and most of the youth demands are not anti-capitalist in nature. They are not posing questions to transform the economic structure. This might happen, and hopefully it will, because now there's an opportunity for political debate and organization that did not exist in Egypt before. Now there are parties that are forming and groups that are reorganizing and putting up a political platform. Hopefully, as I said before, this is a big challenge that we will not end up with the Eastern European cases where the movements on the ground, both the quest for democracy that is not guaranteed yet, this formal we did not get there yet. We do not have even that. We still have a military that is in control of Egypt. And as I said before, the movements and depends on how the movements will they continue to protest and check every policy that the army does. And hopefully today is a big day. We'll see what the referendum says, see what people are really thinking about the role of the army in the uprising. So I think I don't think we should underestimate the demands for formal democracy. Just going to Egypt and living there for a month, you wish you had the facilities that many people in the West have, and people in the third world want that and demand that because every human being has the right to have that, I think. Even though we here suffer in the US, I mean, this is an extreme situation of, as I said before, workers are very powerless. But again, this is a question of how the movements on the ground were able to kind of challenge more in Egypt the elites and the capitalist class in demanding more and more rights. And this is a question that needs more time and see what will happen on the ground. As for the military, I think maybe just to compare the Egyptian military, as I think I agree with you, there's differences between the elite of the military and the most kind of the simple soldiers, who I would say that partly explains why the elites of the military decided to kind of ask Mubarak to step down, because they would not have, I think that the regular soldiers would have been a problem for regular soldiers to attack their brothers and sisters in the protests. That would have been a serious problem for the military, and I think this was part of the consideration. But in Egypt, this complete alliance between the military and the regime, economic, political, is actually dependent completely on, very much on U.S. support. The salaries that the officers take are based on U.S. support. So this military has to, as I said before, be checked continuously, and its interests are clearly not with the revolution. I don't think there should be ambiguity around that. The interest of the military in Egypt is with the counter-revolution that is being put out there, and this is why I think there's a lot of challenges for the movement.
As far as the food issue is concerned, food prices, I think that is a continuing issue that's going to develop in more intensity as time goes on. It was very important in Algeria and other parts of North Africa and the Middle East, but I think that was more the initial surface issue, the volcanic rage that all of us have talked about that's been seething for so many years in these societies has been there, and these are little fissures that develop with an immediate issue like the food prices. And so they allowed for that kind of escape and protest in very spectacular forms. As far as the democracy and dual power issue is concerned, I think both positions are really true. I think that one can't underestimate the significance of people who've been facing repression and potential torture, imprisonment for years and years, to finally get some free space for free expression. What form that's going to take in the long run is still to be determined. My only hope would be that it's not going to stop with the formalities of the so-called liberal democratic system. I do think, as Horace was expressing, that it needs to go far deeper, that it needs to be a democratization of life in every realm. And that, in fact, was, I'll tell you personally, that is very much what inspired me in getting connected with Algeria back in the 1960s, because that is what the promise was of self-management. It was not only a model for the workers themselves, but a model for eventually the self-management in every realm of society. That was articulated in the FLN's party charter. The political strength behind that was not sufficient to make it work out, but it was definitely in the minds of many proponents. As far as Libya is concerned, the thing that I found most interesting with Libya was in the initial days when you had newspaper reports of these local neighborhood and town committees being formed, just more or less spontaneously, to try to organize life themselves. It can happen. People know how to organize themselves if they're given the opportunity to do so, and apparently they were very creative in doing that. As far as the military goes, it absolutely is the case in Algeria as well, that there are these divisions between the higher levels, incredibly corrupt generals at the highest level and who've been used to wielding their authority for many years, and some of the younger officers who are very critical of the continued military dominance of the political system. In fact, there's an organization of what is called the Algerian Movement for Free Officers, which is based in exile, consisting of officers who were involved in the Algerian military in the 1990s, who saw the kind of vicious, repressive tactics and manipulation, even to the point of the military sponsoring what were called radical Islamist massacres, but the weight of the evidence is that it was the military themselves who were carrying them out and acting like radical Islamists. And this kind of experience mobilized a certain number of these officers to quit the army, to stay in exile, and to periodically issue these major critiques about the existing regime, and that's a very encouraging development, I think. The last thing is about solidarity. There are all kinds of things that we can think of. A lot was done with regard to South Africa in trying to develop its own more democratic regime, throwing off the white rule there. One of the things that struck me as I've been looking on the websites about Algeria is that there are so many American companies who are supporting arms sales to Algeria and have other kinds of involvements, major involvements in the extraction of natural gas and oil. In addition, there are these important figures of the Algerian regime who, to play it safe, like these other rulers in North Africa and the Middle East, are putting much of their money abroad, buying up properties. And there are several properties that I found just by a quick check on the web in Bethesda, Maryland, by the guy who used to be the Minister of Energy and is now potentially under indictment for corruption. You know, certain people get expendable at a certain point if it's too embarrassing. But there are those similar kinds of investments, I'm sure, by leading elements of the existing Algerian regime. And it would be interesting to have some kind of demonstrations, some kind of significant publicity about who it is who's investing next door or who's investing in the town that you live in.
It's actually a great disrespect to the fact that the people of Egypt don't have the ability to make revolution on their own without being organized by the US. That's arrogance.
Okay.
I just want to say that I want to thank you for your comments. And as a young person, I want to say that the Arab language, the Arab culture, Arab history is important, but at this juncture, that pan-Arabism have to interrogate its history of slavery in Sudan, in Mauritania, and have to interrogate colonialism. Most of the people talking about pan-Arabism today is not speaking about the Western Sahara and the colonial question, and the Moroccans will not support anything that is pan-Arab that supports anti-colonialism. And we in Africa, that's why the African Union support the Western Sahara. We cannot go forward without solving outstanding colonial questions. So you can't have revolution in Tunisia and have colonialism in North Africa. It's not possible. So that's why when we speak, we have to link what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt to the revolution and colonialism in Palestine and Western Sahara. That's what will make us left.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. And that's it. Thank you.